Okay, today what we're going to be looking at are the powers of Congress. Very quickly, so far we've already looked at the legislative branch, the terms and qualifications of the House and the Senate. With special attention to the House, we've looked at appropriation, apportionment, reapportionment, and gerrymandering. Again, all of those having to do with the House, not the Senate. But today we're going to look at the powers of Congress. It is mentioned in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Now, I'd ask you to go all the way back to the Constitution was passed. We had the British ruling us for many years. Then we had the Articles of Confederation. Many people during the debate of the Constitution were afraid of an all-powerful federal government, or at least a federal government that had the number going from 10% to 50%. How would it stop at 50% was the fear. In the Constitution, they basically tried to be very specific of the powers of this brand new government. If you look at the clauses 1 through 17, and there are only 18 clauses in Section 8, they are going to be very, very, very specific. No wiggle room. I don't list them all, but I list some of the basic stuff. Congress can borrow money, very specific. Congress can build and raise a navy. Congress can coin money. They can establish post offices, lay and collect taxes, regulate interstate commerce, which, if you recall, under the Articles of Confederation, they could not do. I hope you see that these are very, very, very specific things. Now, if we look at the 18th clause, that is going to be kind of vague. Congress can make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying out into execution the above powers. Now, basically what that means is they can make any law that is necessary and proper, but they have to hook it back into one of those very specific things. All right? And we'll look at that. Another overarching concept is between 1789 and 1930, really 7, or in execution in 1933, our government didn't do much. They were strict constructionists of the Constitution. They did only what they were allowed to do. In 1933, things changed with the election of FDR, of course. What we had was the Great Depression. As you can take a look at some of these pictures here, the squalor that people lived in, the soup kitchens. You can see the elderly here who are hurting financially and physically, and people looking for work. What is the solution? The question begs. The old way was basically government does nothing. For FDR said there's a new way of doing things. Let the government get involved. So they passed a Social Security Act. They passed unemployment insurance. They passed the WPA. They were a very active federal government. Again, the old way was government would not, nor they could not help. And if you look at other countries, a lot of other countries did have the exact same attitude. I mean, there was a few like Germany who were having Social Security programs, but not many. Again, governments were not there to be the solution in these things. And the group that helped out people were charities. So, now having said all that, let's get back to the powers of Congress. I think it would be prudent to say most people think Social Security is a good idea. Most people think that unemployment insurance is a good idea, and maybe the WPA or any of these programs that were passed are good ideas, but the question remains is what power did Congress have to pass those laws? What of those 17 were used? And that's going to be an interesting question. So there's a new way of thinking. Is there? Many of FDR New Deal programs were brought to the Supreme Court asking that very question. What power did Congress have in passing these new legislation? Now remember, we had Hoover and Coolidge and other Republican presidents during this time, sandwiched between Wilson and Roosevelt. So there are going to be 5 Supreme Court justices on there that were put on by Republicans. And the Supreme Court basically says the Congress has no power because it does not relate to one of those 17. So many of the things that the Supreme Court were brought to the Supreme Court were found to be unconstitutional, again, because it was not related to one of those 17 powers. And again, many of the judges were appointed by Republican presidents, thus voting 5-4. Now, FDR is very frustrated. He's like, I have the House passes a bill, the Senate passes the bill, I signed the bill, and yet the Supreme Court is ruining the help that we're trying to provide to Americans. And now he's just going to have to wait until one of those 5 judges retire so he can put a liberal on the court. And in the end, he came up with this plan called the packing the court. For any judge that is over 70 years old, he will have the ability to pass or appoint a new Supreme Court justice. And Congress, that even though it's filled with Democrats, all were aghast by this. They clearly saw a problem with the separation of powers in this way. And in the end, he dropped the plan. I don't think he really counted on how many Democrats would be that upset by it. But it did have an effect. One of the justices that was voting with the majority in the 5-4 switched sides. And it is called the switch in time saves 9. So now they started actually voting with the liberals. And then more of those Republican and conservative judges started to retire because they were going to lose. So as of 1935, the Supreme Court started finding in favor of New Deal programs, now finding just cause through the 18th clause. This acted as a steroid for Congress and the federal government. They started to become very active in doing many things. Medicare, Medicaid, free lunch programs for the poor in schools, heating oil subsidies for poor, health warnings on cigarettes. Again, not too many people would be against this, but the strict constructionist of the Constitution would say, but what of the 1 through 17 does this apply to? Civil Rights Act of 1964. There are 2 cases that I'll kind of summarize and make it fictitious just so you can understand the point. Again, many parts of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but they were trying to outlaw discrimination in interstate commerce. So basically what you had was, let's say you had a Denny's in Georgia that refused to sit an African-American couple. That couple would sue. And because, and that case would go all the way through the court system. And in the end, because there's a Denny's, let's say in Georgia, in South Carolina, and Illinois, that is interstate commerce, crossing state lines. So through that, it gives power to Congress to regulate commerce and thus ban discrimination. There was another court case, and again, I'll just summarize briefly. Let's say you had a mom and pop restaurant in Texas who just had one store, just one, and they discriminated and refused to seat African-American couple. They sued, went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the lawyers for the African-American couple basically said, if you look at this mom and pop restaurant, where do they get their knives? Where do they get their spoons? Where do they get their tables? Where do they get their chairs? Where do they get their linoleum? Where do they get their ovens? All of those come from different states, which means interstate commerce. And the Supreme Court sided with them. Now, using their logic, what can't the government do using this logic of interstate commerce? And again, I hope you grasp what I was using the word steroid. It magnifies the power of Congress. For many years, for about 40, 50 years, the Supreme Court had a liberal tilt to it through the Warren Court, and then basically with Reagan's presidency, you started to see a shift back to the right, to the conservative side. And you see some of the effects. In 1995, they heard a court case called the Gun-Free School Zone Act, which made it illegal to bring a gun to school. Again, this is Congress passing a law. As a matter of fact, you couldn't bring it closer than 100 yards, I believe. Again, nobody would dispute the good rationale behind it. As a matter of fact, this kid did bring it back, did bring a gun to school, and the FBI charged him with a federal crime. And in the end, that court case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, U.S. versus Lopez, and the justices were basically asking, what gives Congress the right to pass a gun-free school zone act? What of the 17 does that attach to? And the 4 justices and the lawyer for the United States were saying the Interstate Commerce Clause, Interstate Commerce Clause. Well, the 5 justices were not biting, and this is the first time since 1935 or 1937 that the Supreme Court struck down a law passed by Congress as a violation of the Interstate Commerce Clause. So it was a big shift. So clearly there's a debate over small government, the Republicans, versus big government, Democrats. Republicans, strict constructionists, Democrats, loose constructionists. Obamacare is yet another perfect example of that. It seemed like it was going to come down to this one concept of Interstate Commerce Clause versus not being Interstate Commerce Clause. And in court, it was argued as such. And everybody assumed that it was going to be shot down or struck down. In the end, the Obama administration won because 4 of the justices said they agreed that it's constitutional based on the Commerce Clause, the Interstate Commerce Clause. But the 5th person, Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts, said he agrees because if you don't buy insurance, that's a form, there's a penalty you have to pay, and that penalty is a tax. So Roberts allowed the Affordable Health Care Act as a tax. He said he did not agree that was interstate commerce, though. And of course, that gave the majority to the Obama stance for Obamacare. The 4 strict constructionists said they found that law unconstitutional on the grounds of interstate commerce. So that's it. Hope you have a better understanding of the big fight between big government, small government, and it's all tied back to the 17 very strict parts of Article 1, Section 8, and Article 1, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, the Necessary and Proper Clause.